I parked just beyond the last functioning street lamp, where its tired light bled into the overgrown verge and gave up, letting darkness settle in like a second skin. The village graveyard crouched behind a low stone wall, its slanted slate teeth listing in all directions. The wrought iron gate was buttoned shut with a chain the size of my wrist, a hangman's knot of oxidized links. I didn't need the opening. The wall was barely to my chest, and I'd already decided, long before I drove here, that I wasn't going home without walking where the rumor said midnight made shadows move. There are things you do because you're curious, and things you do because curiosity sits on your chest and pulls the air out of you unless you obey. This visit was the second kind. The legend had drifted through the village like autumn smoke. Every night at midnight, the shadows in the graveyard wake up. They slick over stone and yew and path like oil, and they watch. And if you're foolish enough to meet their eyes, if shadows have eyes, you don't come back the same. Some say you don't come back at all. Maybe you're thinking it was bravado that brought me there. It wasn't. I'd given up on bravado years ago when my father's voice had stopped answering at the other end of the phone, replaced by an undertaker's that kept saying, "I'm sorry for your loss," as if that were an instruction manual. My father was buried in this yard, though not under his name. Not anywhere official. That was the true rumor that lived underneath the other. A caretaker who'd hidden a handful of debts, more than a handful of bodies, and when the winter thawed and the ground shifted, the village dug and found mischief where sanctity should have been. The caretaker vanished. The cemetery closed. The diocese posted a sign that the ground was under remediation, a phrase that tasted like bleach and lies. I clambered over the wall and landed in damp grass that sighed around my boots. The expected boneyard smell, earth, old flowers, rain, was sharper here, tinged with something metallic, the coin-on-tongue tang that blood leaves in the air long after it dries. It might have been my imagination. My flashlight's beam jumped when my hand shook, and I forced a slow breath to steady it. The beam wound along the path, past the stump of a lich-gate whose roof had slumped into a bad hat years before, past a slew of leaning stones feathered with lichen. Names shone up in white flakes under my light, dates that began in the 1800s and stopped more recently, then stopped altogether. There was a sound, like a foot dragged over grit. My pulse hiccuped. I spun the beam. It found only a yew tree whose lower branches dragged the path, finger-long needles spilling like damage. The needles trembled, wind or something heavier grazing them. The night didn't breathe. The air was so still I could hear my own shirt move against my ribs. Wind, I said to no one, because saying it made it true. The path divided. Right toward the caretaker's cottage, a humpy shadow against the side of the church. Left toward the old crypt and the newer, cheaper rows of graves laid down in a hurry after some flu year. I went left. Courage is ridiculous, but it has a shape. Mine felt like a line I could follow, and if I looked too far to either side, I'd stumble. I kept the beam low. It caught the close-up world, a cracked angel missing an arm, a toppled urn weeping rust from its iron ring, the glossy slugshine on a stone's wet edge. The grass shrank from my steps with a quiet, sopping hush. No insects sang. Even the church's clock had lost its voice in the restoration. The belfry sat with its mouth shut. My watch, which I'd inherited along with my father's unreasonable debts, ticked fatly at my wrist, its one reliable trick. It was 11:41. 19 minutes until midnight. Don't be dramatic, I told myself. You're a person walking through a field with rocks that people have carved names into. That's all a graveyard is. My beam pinned a new headstone at the end of a row, pale granite veined like milk. A brassy vase sat in its base with a handful of plastic lilies, the color of bruises. The stone's inscription had been left blank below the chiseled, in-loving memory. It was waiting. I moved on. The path curled like a question toward the shadow-ass mouth of the family crypt. Stone angels slumped over a lintel carved with a surname eroded to a laughable smudge. Behind it, the graveyard fell away in terraces toward the back wall, where trees pressed their faces against the stones and peered in. A fox might have lived here. A badger, maybe. The soil dotted with the delicate freckles of droppings and the softer, darker stains of things that had fallen and not been picked up. It was a poor place. You could tell from the way the dead were left to weather and the living left to look away. At 11:48, I heard footsteps. The first two steps were unmistakable. Heel, toe, a human rhythm. Someone walking over the path behind me. I swallowed the urge to bolt. Reason had a voice, and it was my father's. Steady in the way of men who'd learned not to throw their steadiness around, because then it would leave. Turn slowly, it said. You won't see anything by whipping around like a weather vane after a storm. I turned. The beam walked backward along the path. There was no one there. The yew branches lay still as cut hair. The iron gate hulked behind its chain. My footprints in the damp, distorted ovals with water wrinkled in their edges. Nothing walked in the wet grass beside them. The only motion my breath, smoking in thread-thin folds I could barely see. Okay, I said. We're okay. The steps came again, 3 this time. The beam jerked and slashed blind as I did exactly what reason had just told me not to. The path was empty. The world had turned into a stage with bad cues. I shut off the light. Darkness rushed in like water filling a room. For a few seconds there was only blackness and the flash fire of my own heartbeat in my eyes. Then, slowly, the graveyard emerged in brooding outlines. The paler faces of stones, the humped blackness of the crypt door, the bruised blue of the sky pressing down on the church's roofline. And the shadows thickened. Not the simple ones laid down by what little light the sky conceded, but deeper smears that clung to the sides of stones and spooled like ink into the grass. With the light off, I heard the footsteps, not behind me now, not in front, but all around. Soft, deliberate, synchronized, like many people pacing in a small circular room they had to share. They were faint enough to dismiss, except they matched the thrum in my veins and the breathy tick-tick of my watch. The sound pressed, though the air still didn't move. I turned the flashlight back on and screamed without sound because the beam was full of a face. It was limestone, not flesh. The busted angel's face, fallen from some high perch and landed at a tilt in the path. A deep crack split its forehead like a knife wound. Someone had smeared dirt over its eyes, or perhaps moss had colonized them, giving the impression of blindfolds. Its mouth had no lips. I had almost stepped on it, and when the beam found it, those moss-dark eyes stared into me with an intensity that felt personal. That is the foolish trick of the human brain, to look at something devoid of life and see soul anyway, and sometimes feel the soul looking back. Just a statue, I said. Merely a statue. My voice sounded like 2 coins clicked together. I tried to step around it. My jeans caught on something. I looked down and found a strand of something that wasn't wire snagged on my pocket rivet. My mouth filled with a broth of fear and saliva. It was hair. Human hair, long and the color of ashes. It tugged once against my pants, not a snag but a grip. I swore and ripped it away. It broke with the sudden, awful elasticity that only living things have. The flashbeam jittered over the grass. It wasn't a scalp. It was a lock, clotted at one end as if torn from a brush and dropped. "Fox nest," I hissed, casting about for a mess of rotted leaves it might have been tucked into, and realized I was inventing foxes like a child invents friends. My watch shivered at my wrist. 11:57. I didn't leave. Why? I can only explain the logic as the desire not to believe I was the sort of person who fled. Leaving would have meant admitting there was something here that could make me, a grown adult, lose to nothing more than the promise of midnight. Some arrogance is bone deep, beyond argument. I kept going, past the crypt whose doorway exhaled cold that smelled of damp stone and the kind of rot that polymerizes into something chemical, towards the back wall where the ground sloped and the yews thickened. Their trunks were not so much trunks as a dozen braided limbs pressed together, the bark flaking like old varnish. Between them, the space was dense with pooled shadow. I saw something move there. Not the swish of branches, not the rustle of an animal. Something flat and precise, one shadow slipping over another without any change of light to cause it. It folded itself along the base of a headstone like a tide, and then drew back, exposing the stone, then covered it again like a black tongue tasting a tooth. My heart bucked. I switched off the flashlight again, instinctively, to see if it was a trick of my beam. In the soot light, the shadow kept moving, oily against the dim sheen of stone. The first bell struck. It wasn't from the church. That bell was gutted, I remembered. This was a small, bright sound as if someone were striking a glass with a fingernail, clear as cold water. It cracked the night an exact number, 1. It sounded again, a heartbeat later, 2. I realized it wasn't a clock's bell. The rhythm was wrong. There was a human irregularity in it, a quiver. I followed the sound like a sleepwalker. The caretaker's cottage was a squat hump of stone to the right of the church, roof sagging so low it looked asleep. One window left unboarded gaped with its glass punched out. The bell sound came from within, 3, 4, 5, each note thinner than the one before, like a fragile chime tapped by a nervous hand. I reached the sill and shined my light inside. Dust wove its own constellations in the beam. The cottage's interior had been stripped down to a table with one leg splinted and a chair that looked as if it would complain about being sat upon. A shelf slumped over the sink like it had lost a fight years ago. The bell was hanging from the ceiling on a red cord. It was a funerary bell, a safety measure. The kind they'd tie to a wrist and feed through a coffin lid in the Victorian years when doctors weren't sure the dying really had, and some poor staffer would walk the graveyard with a lantern and listen for rings. 6. I swallowed. The bell string wasn't moving. The bell wasn't moving either, and yet it rang. A trick of vibration? The thread of sound lowered itself into the corners of the room and sipped at the edges there. 7. Time is an argument that fear always wins. When you're afraid, the counting insists. 8, 9. The bell's tone grew steady, too steady to be struck by a hand. It began to sound more like a wire being bowed, clear to the point of pain. My muscles wanted to run in several directions at once. I turned away from the window, and that's when a smaller sound whispered the word that froze me. My name. Not in any voice I knew. Not even in a human voice. It had the timbre of air leaving a cold pipe. But it formed my name, 1 syllable, 5 letters, as easily as frost forms flowers on a pane. The sound came from my left, low and very close to the ground. I bent in spite of myself. The flashlight's beam found a row of stones stumped near the foundation of the cottage. The first 4 had names. The 5th had no name, only a date, tonight's. The letters were fresh, the numbers sharp-edged under the dust. Beneath the date, a thin steel tube emerged from the grass and angled toward the cottage window, a speaking tube, the end of it cut slant like a reed. Someone, once, had meant to listen here for the voices of the not dead. Someone had left it in place to drink other words. The fact that the date was tonight's felt like a punch that knocked me clean out of my version of reality. I stumbled back and hit the table with my hip, then realized I wasn't in the cottage, and laughed. A strange, cracked sound that didn't belong to me. My hand landed on the windowsill and came away dusted with something white and soft as ash. I rubbed my fingers together and thought, bone. I looked out into the graveyard, intending to flee. The darkness had thickened. That's too mild a way to say it. It had congealed. Patches of it had risen like water on hot oil and formed shapes that were not shapes, more like limits within the dark, edges that moved. They skated along the ground like skaters on a black pond. They did not look at me because they had nothing to look with, but the attention felt like a physical thing lowering onto the top of my head, pressing down. 10. The bell shook the air so thin my flashlight's beam looked cut by it. The nearer shadow reared. It did not stand the way a human stands. It was as if a silhouette unpeeled itself from the earth and found a third dimension briefly before melting again. In that lifted moment, it had my outline. Not similar, a match. Shoulders narrow, head tilted like I tend to, one hand slightly raised because I had been peeling a stubborn label off a bottle earlier and my thumb was chafed. The shadow had that too, the slight splay. It loomed, then collapsed, but when it collapsed, it did not simply lie back. It flowed along the ground in a deliberate line, flattening and stretching to the length of the path leading away, like a carpet unfurled ahead of me. I stepped onto it. I don't know why. Maybe stepping on something proves it's not you. The moment my boot sole touched the dark, it leapt up around my ankle like cool cloth. I gagged. I yanked my foot back. The shadow let go with a little reluctance, a cling that made my skin crawl as if something had touched bare flesh through socks and boot leather. 11. I should have run. I did not. I made the most unforgivable choice. I wanted to know. Fear can crouch in the same tight place with fascination, and sometimes the fascination rises first. I raised the light. The beam stroked the ground, found nothing, slid over to a stone that was new enough to be legible. I read the name. I didn't know it. The next, unknown. The next, another unknown. The fourth had a surname I recognized, a mason from town who'd gone under in winter. Above their dates, a streak of black lay like a bruise, and when I lowered the beam, the streak slid away from the light, not like a shadow shrinking, but like it didn't want to be seen. The bell fell silent. I checked my watch. Midnight. The graveyard exhaled, not the wind, but something like the idea of wind, the pressure changing as if many doors in many small rooms had opened all at once. The shadows rose. There is no true way I can write it that will convince you if you haven't felt it. To be watched by something that isn't a person, hasn't the shape of a person, but has the focus and the will. Why? I said, and the question fell apart on my tongue because there was no one to ask, only many. The shadows gathered. Not a mob, not the chaos of black water swirling, but a sort of choreography. They flowed along the edges of stones and lined the path. They kept to the ground, but they rose in thin curls, the way the smoke from a spent candle sometimes returns to itself. They formed two lines along the path that led back to the wall where I'd climbed in. An aisle. An invitation. That's a trick, I said to myself, which is something you say when you have no other name for kindness or cruelty. The aisle waited, and something in me lifted its chin. The shadow that had my shape unpeeled again beside my right foot and slunk forward, then paused. It lifted a bit, a sliver of flank like a fish at the surface, and went on. I followed. The flashlight skittered over markers and engravings I didn't read. My boots whispered. As I walked between them, the shadows brushed my calves. It wasn't a bad touch. It was curious, brief strokes like cold silk that left behind a gentle ache, as if something hungry had tasted and moved on. They sped me, then slowed, and when I tried to hurry past, the black on my left curled and tightened like weed around an ankle in a pond, not dragging, merely warning. Present. I looked over my shoulder. The aisle behind had closed. The black had pooled in my footprints. If I ran, I'd step only on night. Where are we going? I asked. They answered. The answer was not words, but it was clean. A pull the way the ocean pulls at your legs when it's going home. It directed me past the new plots toward the old, where the stones were tilted like bad teeth and the names were half swallowed by lichen. Past those, into a notch at the back wall where the grass had been scraped. The yews hid it if you didn't know to look. I knew, though I didn't know how I knew. I knelt. The soil was not fresh. It had been dug and patched over years ago, then again more recently, then again very recently. The smell of it wrapped my head, sour, metallic, sweet in a wrong way, like candy gone off. There was a flat stone half covered. I brushed grass aside with my gloved hand. The inscription was shallow, done in haste. Initials, a dash, then none. The lower half had been hacked at with something sharp. Two grooves made like rectangles but left unfinished. The earth trembled lightly under my hand. No, tremble is too dramatic. It breathed. It was as if a thin layer of something beneath the topsoil, a membrane, drew in and out so gently I would have missed it if my knuckles weren't pressed down. My stomach lurched. I leaned back on my heels, light raised, and it found the steel again. Another speaking tube, this one wider, rising like a reed out of the vandalized grave and snaking toward the wall. Its cleanly cut mouth faced me. From it, a whisper, my name again, insistent, and this time followed by a sound like crying laughter. I understood all at once. The caretaker hadn't been listening for people buried alive. He had been teaching the dead, or near dead, or whatever lay in the interval between, how to speak. No, I said to the dark. No. The shadows didn't argue. They pressed. Their pressure was an invitation and a plea, and under it lived anger so old it felt like the place's own temper. I stood. The beam found something pale wedged behind the hacked stone. A hand? Bones. Not laid respectfully, not nested, thrown. The grave had been used as a pit. The caretaker had hid debts and bodies in all senses. My father's face rose in my mind the way images rise on paper in a developing tray, grain by grain, and I knew suddenly why I had dreamed of this place for weeks without meaning to. There were men here who had owed what he owed, and the collector had a preferred ground. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't know who I was saying it to. The shadows around my ankles tightened again, quick, not painful, a little impatient. The aisle opened deeper, not toward the exit now, but inward, diagonally across the slope to the church's shadow, where the land dipped and pooled rain, or lately failed to drain anything at all. "All right," I whispered. "Show me." They led me to a stone I hadn't noticed. It was new in the sense that the letters hadn't had time to soften, but old in the sense that the years on it were a decade gone. The slab lay flush with the ground, a modern taste. The name carved there stopped my breath, not my father's, mine. I squatted. The beam drank the white of the letters. The date of birth matched mine. The dash after had no second anchor. The stone was blank where an ending should be. Cold wrote itself along my throat in script I couldn't read. My first thought was the village's stupid prank, their way of scaring off trespassers. My second thought was worse. This was what had been waiting for that in loving memory stone by the path. This one was a template the caretaker had carved in advance for whomever he lured here, gullible and alone. And my third thought, the one I didn't want to have, was the one the shadows wanted me to hold. Perhaps the man had never left. Perhaps he had poured himself into what he had trained. Perhaps his debt now was an absence of a body, and the graveyard had been paying interest ever since. The shadows massed. A pressure built, not just around my legs now, but up through the soles of my boots, into my calves, my thighs. The flashlight stuttered as if the batteries were being pinched. The air thinned until my next breath felt like trying to drink through cheesecloth. A thread of something tugged at the back of my mind, and I had the ridiculous image of a child pulling on a mother's sleeve to show her something terrible and necessary. And then the necessary thing rose. It didn't rise from the ground. It came from my outline. Imagine standing in a bright doorway and your shadow lying on the floor in front of you, and then imagine it growing impatient and deciding it would not be governed by your body anymore. Imagine it gathering itself and pulling away. That is what it did. It took the shape of me but not the thickness of me, a skin of darkness blown up by breath. Where my breath stuttered, it did not. It stepped, not with feet but in phases, like the way light fails across a room in stages when a bulb blows. It faced me. It had no face. Still, I knew it was looking. It was me, minus the weight of blood and the pretense of bravery. The bell in the cottage chimed once, a solitary shrug of sound, and the shadow me cocked its formless head as if remembering how to be alive. "What do you want?" I asked it, my mouth barely willing to move. The answer came as pressure rather than words, a gentle push at the ribs, a tightness behind the eyes, a ring of cold around my wrist where my father's watch was. It wanted the watch. It wanted the tick. It wanted time, the measure of it, the anchor. It wanted to finish what had been started, a date chiseled into stone without an end. No. The word surprised me with the steadiness of its vowel. It uncoiled something in the dark around me, a hiss like sand poured into a bottle. The aisle constricted. My shadow self leaned, its edges shuddered, sloughed, gathered, reached. The cold came toward my chest with the inoffensive inevitability of a tide. I stepped back, it followed. I turned and ran, and the aisle tried to close, but it wasn't that kind of trap. It preferred consent. It wanted me to walk out with it, wearing me like a tight suit. I didn't give it the dignity. I crashed through the lines where the shadows were thickest, and they recoiled with a cold that burned. My boots thudded the path. The flashlight percussed against my palm. Names and flowers and the blank slab of what was ready to hold me blurred by. Behind me, the shadow me skated, silent, tireless, its forward edge lifting and lapping like a wave. The wall, the iron gate, the chain glinted like a thing that could still say no. I put a hand on the top of the wall and the stone crumbled under my fingers with a groan like an old dog, and I lurched, scraped my shin, and fell into the grass on the outside with a noise so loud in that night it might have been a bomb. Something cold kissed the heel of my boot as it scissored over the wall, a last affectionate gone missing in the night touch. And then I was on the road, the street lamp's old gold pushing against the dark like a tired soldier. The air moved, actual wind, a breath of it, rich with ditch water and someone's chimney. It smelled like life. I spat out a curse and rolled to my hands. The watch on my wrist hammered. My shadow on the pavement jumped. It was the right size and shape, and it obeyed the light the way a shadow should. I laughed again, and the laugh sounded more like me. When I stood and staggered toward the car, I made the mistake of looking back. There, at the gate, the dark seemed more than dark. It pooled against the slatted bars like water against a dam, not quite seeping through, though the lower bars were threaded with a lace of it, like fingers thin as twigs feeling for a way. The aisle didn't exist anymore. The shadows had returned to their general positions, to their duties. The pressure reduced to a hum, a presence like a store's electricity when the lights are off. Only the watch around my wrist kept beating too fast, as if my blood had been replaced with small horses. I drove home by the long road, as if taking the longer route would put more miles between me and what waited in that yard. It was 3 by the time I parked. My apartment's stairwell smelled of old fruit and neighbors' dinners. The mirror in the hall caught my face unprepared. Colorless, eyes rimmed like the inside of mussel shells. I stripped my clothes and threw them in the shower, then on a mean impulse shook the pocket of my jeans out over the sink. A lock of hair fell, ash blonde, clotted at one end. I slept poorly. When I woke, it was because sunlight had found a gap in the curtain and was burning a line across my pillow. My mouth had the fur of old pennies. The watch said 11:04 a.m. Its tick had slowed. I held my breath. Tick. Another long interval. Tick. The second hand hopped in resentful little movements. I took the watch off. My wrist was ringed with a faint gray mark where the metal had sat, as if something had licked there, too often and too long. I put the watch in the drawer beside my bed and closed it. The apartment suddenly sounded too big and too small at once. I found I was listening, for a bell, yes, but also for the small sounds in walls and floors that registers as house speech. The house was quiet. The city was not. A bus hissed at the corner, someone shouted about football, a dog laughed and coughed. I made coffee. I made the mistake of looking at my shadow on the kitchen floor. It was normal in every way except one. At my wrist, where the watch had been, the shadow ended in a ragged notch, as if something had taken a bite from the outline. Midnight brought me back to the graveyard the next night. I don't say that to excuse myself. This is confession. Compulsion wrapped itself in rationality. The watch, even in the drawer, had ticked just loudly enough to contaminate the inside of my head. When I stood at the gate, the chain looked different, newer. It had been replaced during the day. The sign on the wall, under remediation, had been knocked straighter. Someone had done work here while I had been eating cereal and staring at my wrist. The wind moved tonight. It eased through the yews and made the needles whisper like conspirators. I climbed the wall anyway. I stood just inside, the grass damp, the smell of the place like a hand pressed lightly over my face. The first shadow unrolled at my shoes with the care of a host making sure a guest knew where to sit. It didn't touch me. It waited. "I know you," I said, and the way I said it woke something in new small rooms inside me. Rooms that hadn't been there yesterday, a little darker than the others. "I know what you want." The bell's first chiming came fainter tonight, as if the air itself resisted the sound. The watch was not on my wrist. It was at home, 3 kilometers away, under socks. The second chime struck. The third. The shadows gathered. I didn't move. The aisle formed. It opened not inward as before, but toward the gate and the road beyond. It made a path straight to the low wall, an invitation extended, not to lure, but to release. I stood where I was, a stubborn point of human error in the graveyard's otherwise impeccable geometry. I finally understood the twist, though of course what we call a twist is merely the point at which our ignorance gives way. The shadows had not wanted me as food. They had wanted me as witness. The caretaker had left the yard full of half-made things, half-dug holes, half-engraved stones, half-freed voices. He had taught the ground to drink human contours and speak human shapes. He had filled it with debt, and debt is a thing that likes to balance its books. It had called me as one of its figures, not to add me to the ledger, but to open it and show me the math. The aisle waited halfway open. A third path unfurled in small, shy strokes, like something learning how to draw a line by practicing at the margin. It angled toward the caretaker's cottage. The bell's thread of sound held steady and thin, like silk pulled through teeth. I went not because I was brave, but because the alternatives were to remain or to run, and I am bad at both. Inside the cottage, dust slumped in the corners. The little bell swung on its red string without moving. a physics defiance that had become ordinary. The table had scuff marks shaped like hands. On the floor, an old ledger lay under debris, half its spine chewed by damp. I picked it up, and it peeled away from the stone with a sound like rootlets breaking. The penmanship had the dignity of an era that is always pretending it wasn't full of human mistakes. Burial accounts, names, sums owed. The notes, delivered to yard at night, settled with the father, arranged with parish, balance in person. The last line repeated under different names, always with a date, always with a dash where the second date should be. I turned pages until I found my father's surname. The sum next to it could have bought a small house. The note, arranged, balance forthcoming. My chest went hollow, cleanly, like a gourd scraped for lantern use. I closed the ledger. I put it back on the floor. I left the cottage and stood at the window, looking out across the yard. The shadows waited as if a conversation mattered to them. I spoke the only apology that made my mouth hurt to form. "I did not pay," I said to the man who had preyed upon men like my father and made a currency of misery, to the idea that a graveyard could want anything. "We did not repay, I know." The shadows flicked, a simultaneous unpleasant shiver like fish that have just been hooked. Then they smoothed. A pressure, once I named the thing it wanted named, bled away. Around my wrist, the ghost of the watch tightened once, then loosened, as if someone had let go at last. The aisle turned toward the wall again. The shadows stretched along it in a long sigh. The bell fell silent, as if a hand had settled lightly over it and soothed it quiet. I walked out between them. They parted. They touched me in places, brief and cold and not unkind. At the wall I turned. I wanted to look. At the blank stone, at the not names, at the tube that taught the dead to speak. But the graveyard had slipped into its regular mask, a patchwork of night and less night. The dark looked like dark again. The yews breathed. Back in my apartment, I opened the drawer and took out the watch. I held it in my palm. It ticked like a creature that had found a warm den again. I considered smashing it. Instead, I set it face up on the windowsill. Its second hand moved with fortitude, then smoothed into a rhythm that agreed with my own. Below, the city coughed and laughed and complained, and went on being a place alive with arguments and mercy. Do I know what lurks in the graveyard at midnight? Yes. Not a monster, not a phantom, though if your shadow ever starts to practice standing up on its own, don't look it in the mouth. The thing that lurks is the sum of all the unfinished things humans leave behind where they pretend endings happen. It's what accumulates when debts, of money, of grief, of names on stone, go unpaid. It learns from anyone who teaches it. It doesn't like to be contradicted. But it does like to be seen. Sometimes when I pass the graveyard in daylight, the wall looks lower than I remember, and the chain looks newer, then older again, as if time slides a thumb over it. The sign has fallen. The letterbox at the caretaker's cottage, which I swear was nailed shut before, hangs open an inch. When midnights are very quiet, the watch at my window ticks just a little louder, or maybe it's the memory of the bell dressed up in brass and gears. 4 nights ago I woke and saw, on my bedroom wall, my shadow sitting up in bed with me, head tilted, listening. It lay down when I moved. It behaved. This morning I noticed something new. On the inside of my wrist, faint as bruises at the edge of healing, I have 5 marks, slender, parallel, reaching a little down my hand. They are the exact width of the bars of a wrought iron gate. They itch when evening comes. I scratch them and tell myself it's a midge bite, or some dermatitis from cheap soap. Then I stand at my window and watch the black seam between buildings thicken into night, and I feel something watch me back from that seam, patient, curious, not cruel. It can wait. It has practice. If you go there at midnight, and you will, if the story I've told you presses on your chest hard enough, don't run. Don't play brave either. Listen, walk down the aisle they make for you. Let them show you the ledger with your name scribbled into a margin no one else bothers to read. Tell what needs telling. And when they open the gate in the dark, go home holding your shadow close like a coat, because it is yours and you earned it. Do I think it's over? No. Debts, like shadows, return with the sun. Somewhere under the yew's braided roots, a hand that is not a hand traces letters into soft stone, a name that is not mine, or maybe it is, a date that is tonight. Somewhere, a bell rings without moving. Somewhere, a caretaker counts and fails to finish. The graveyard is still under remediation. On paper, that means one thing. In the soil, it means another. The ground is still learning how to talk back, and it has a very patient teacher. When the hour thins and the world goes slick with space for other things, I hold my wrist and wait. Some nights, the watch matches my pulse. Some nights, it does not. And for those, I keep a small piece of chalk in my pocket. If the dark around my ankles tightens, I draw a line between my feet and name it mine. The shadows stop shy of that line. They're not cruel. They're only exact. They abide by borders when you show them where they are. What really lurks at midnight is not a creature that wants your blood. It is the part of the world that remembers you promised to come back, to count to the end. If you leave early, it learns the shape of you and waits until you arrive properly. In daylight, it looks like ordinary shade. At night, it thickens. And when it presses the curb of your bed and lifts for just a breath, don't panic. Say, I see you. Say, I know. Say, if you can manage the shame, I'm sorry. Hold your shadow to your bones like a map you intend to follow out. Step carefully. Pay what you can. And when dawn elbows the sky and you walk home from wherever you had to go, you'll feel it at your heels, close as a dog that's decided you are its person, the cold and the hush and the slight insistence. If you manage that, you might find the gate open next time you need to leave. No chain, no stubborn iron. Just two neat rows of darkness, parted like a crowd that has decided to let you pass, and the quiet relief of the ground exhaling when you do. And if, as you cross, you hear the thin ring of a bell and your name softened until it is nothing but sound, answer it. Midnight always keeps listening.